Uh, yeah. So as you already know, I have titled my presentation From Discursive Object to Self-Reflexive Gaze. I will talk about the nature of the discursive role of media, especially in popular culture. I will also talk about self-reflexivity and the gaze. I will not explain these concepts now, but I hope that in the course of my presentation, it will become obvious why I have chosen to come back from the object to the gaze in this analysis of major tropes that we find in popular culture, right? I come from a gender studies space, and when Dr. Kapil actually, contacted me, I said I would like to. This is what my area would be, and it gives me great pleasure to deliberate on a very, very important aspect of our daily existence, and that is popular culture. Right. So all of us are, students of literature, researchers, or faculty. We deal with literature on a regular basis, and very often we forget that most of our identities are mediated and conditioned in our daily existence, and culture actually operates at the level of the popular, right? So we may not necessarily, all of us may not necessarily read literature, not all of us can relate to art, but popular culture is something that you could say, percolates across different classes, different sections of society, and you could see that the intersectionality of race, caste, gender, sex, and the idea of, for example, visual culture today that percolates across the across both urban and rural areas, and especially social media today, which is a very important register for the ways in which we can consume culture. It's very interesting for us to look at this aspect of existence, because that is how we lead our lives today. Popular culture is everywhere. We don't necessarily have to study it like we study literature or the arts, and popular culture has to be factored in when we look at questions of gender or caste, or anything that we do in the English classroom has to resonate with what is happening in the everyday realm. And the everyday realm is mediated by popular culture, be it Bollywood or advertisements, social media platforms, the way in which we consume news today, for example, because news no longer, is facts. News is largely based on opinion today. And that is because you will see that there are horizontal, platforms where news, percolates and spreads across even before it can get into the newspapers. So we live in a time and space where popular culture is a very important register for the ways in which we symbolically connect with the world. I hope you're all with me, or able to, am I audible? And
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So I will go to the next slide. This is how I'm trying to, I'm calling this untying the knots, because when we look at popular culture, it is a huge network of what we today call as the Internet of Things, what we today call as data mining, what we call as the worldwide dark web, right? So a lot of popular culture today is also digital, and a lot of popular culture today is tied up with the ideological, right? And in a diverse society and culture such as India, it becomes very important for us to pick out these strands, right? Because what appears to be popular culture, what appears to be consumed as a dominant ideology, is something that we need to deconstruct. And as academicians, as teachers, as people who probably take popular culture to class, or as teachers who go to a class where popular culture is, is something that students will relate to, right? And I hope that all of us are doing that when we, take important concepts to class, or movements, or theoretical frameworks to class, especially as literature teachers. It becomes important for us to help them to connect with the context, right? The everyday life context. And that's where popular culture becomes very, very important. And we also know that today in our literature syllabi or curriculum across the world, we have popular culture texts entering the, what we today call as cultural studies. And this becomes very important in our negotiations with how we read the world, because what do our students read? Do they read at all? And if they are writing poetry, what do they write? And where do they publish their poetry? So you know that there is so much of slam poetry, there is so much of there is so much of text that goes on Instagram, right? And they would rather use Twitter and Instagram than probably read a text. So we need to be sensitive to these very different ideological shifts that have happened in the ways in which we look at culture, right? So the first and most important thing is there is no identity without culture, right? So all of us are cultural beings, and all of us are symbolic beings who are interacting with the different texts around us. And today, as literature students, we understand that text is no longer a printed text. It's not a publication. It is not something that you sit and read in a library. Space is read today as text, for example. We read performance poetry as poetry today, right? So we look at the idea of geopolitical, right, as text today, because time and space and how it is narrativized within a text. Cinema is a very important text. So even as we have expanded our notion of what the text is, right, it becomes very important for us to understand these different forms of textuality that we are dealing with today, right? And questions of identity are also questions of culture, right? Because there are no questions of caste or gender or race or ethnicity, or the post-colonial idea of the nation, or the global currents of what we today call as transnational, right? The global, the local, largely what we call as the regional even is to a large extent determined by culture, right? So the most important idea that we need to begin with when we start looking at culture is that culture is never direct. It's always discursive. So if you look at the term discursive has two different meanings. One is anything that is discursive belongs to a discourse, right? And the second and most important meaning of discursive is anything that is discursive is not straight. What that simply means is that how we form our identities or how we belong to society, our cultural identities are to a large extent, determined by unseen, unknown, forces, right? So you look at the question of gender, right? The question of how one becomes a woman or one becomes a man, as Bova would call it. You will see that gender is something that is discursive, right? It cannot be, my gender cannot be traced back to a single origin, or it cannot be, traced back immediately to my sex. Although we believe that biological sex is what leads to gender, we know that gender is something that is socially constructed, right? So you will realize that most of our questions of identity are questions that are discursive, because the idea of culture itself, which regulates our identities, is very discursive. What this simply means is that when we deal with culture, we are dealing with ideas, we are dealing with ideologies. We are not dealing with facts. We are not dealing with hardcore material which is available for us to analyze and understand how certain identities are formed. So when we look at questions of gender within the larger rubric of culture, we need to understand that gender is something that is discursive, and gender is also something that is mediated. What that simply means is that the texts we read, the roles we perform, our behavior in society, the rituals that, for example, condition our identity within a particular community or culture or religion, all of these go a long way in, constructing what we call as gender identity, right? For example, I'm Sushma because I'm a Hindu, right? I cannot separate my Hindu identity from my gender, for example. I cannot separate my age from my gender. I cannot, separate the fact that I'm Indian, that I'm a citizen of India, from my performativity of, being a woman, right? So I'm not just a woman. I'm a woman because I'm all of these things, right? Which means that probably I will wear a bindi, probably I will, follow certain, roles that are ascribed to me in society. Or even when I defy those roles, or even when I question those roles, I'm actually mediating with a space, right, which is ideologically conditioning me as a woman. So we cannot look at gender without looking at these, processes of mediation. And mediation is something that happens symbolically, right? So language is the first point of contact with the world, right? Most of our understanding of the world is conditioned by the language that we speak, right? And in today's world, the so can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Yeah, I'm
we can
sorry.
hear you.
I don't know.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm so sorry about that. Yeah. So, so I was talking about mediation, right? So when we talk about media, right, we are looking at something that is more contemporary, something more technological and digital today. But media is as old as human society. In perhaps the first form of media that we interacted with, all of us, was probably the book, right? If you actually look at the book, it is a form of technology, right? The idea that you can read something, that it is tightly bound with a spine at the back, and it is compact in its appearance, right? And it is linear in its progression of text, right? So if you look at the book itself, it is one of the earliest forms of technology. So we don't necessarily have to look at technology as machines, but technologies as very structured and organized ways in which we read our texts, right? So starting with the earliest, media technology, which is probably the newspaper or the book, right? Today we belong to a world where visual culture plays a very important role in the ways in which we look at the world, the ways in which we understand the world, right? So that is the reason why it's important for us to look at processes of mediation. Okay. Consequently, I will be looking at uh, two different approaches to media from the perspective of femininities as well as masculinities. Okay. And at the end of the talk, I will be looking at the cyborg, right, which is more or less a neutral, genderless, ideological position that we take today, because we believe that technology is something that overrules gender or caste or race, but it does not. I will question this idea of the cyborg, which is floating around, which is seemingly very liberal, right? But it comes with its own, packages, right? So we will move from questions of identity to questions of affinities in the cyborg. And this is the course of my presentation. And as you can see very clearly, this illustration, which really hit me very hard when I was, during the COVID period, right? And you know that Amul is one of these companies which makes these very, very interesting ads. And they always make ads based on the contexts that are popular right now. And this is a very interesting popular culture text, because as you can see, there is the idea of the lockdown and women being, burdened with both housework as well as work from home, right? And you can see the woman adeptly using the mobile phone and the laptop, as well as cooking and feeding the child with bread. But then you see, this is precisely the point, right? You will see that you see a woman with a laptop or a mobile phone, seemingly very liberating, but then you see women's roles have not really changed even during the lockdown. In fact, they are handling more tasks, more jobs than what they used to, right? And I think Amul has captured this transition, or this straddling of two worlds, largely by women during the lockdown, right? And for me, this is a text that is heavily loaded with ideological implications of gender, right? So let's go to the next slide. This is actually, I will begin by asking, what is culture, right? Are we born into culture? Is culture something that already exists, always already exists? Or is culture something that is, appropriating us? Do we belong to culture? Are we cultural beings? Or does the idea of culture appropriate us in certain ways, right? What that simply means is culture a reality, or is culture a way of imagining the world, negotiating with the world, communicating with the world? And I would like to believe that culture is the second idea that we just discussed, that it's not something that always already exists. It's the ways in which we interact with the world that becomes culture. Therefore, culture is a process, right? It's not a product. Culture is definitely not a product, right? And that is the reason why the ways in which we negotiate with culture can have implications for the ways in which we identify ourselves, whether it is gender or caste or race. Of course, I will confine myself to questions of gender in this presentation, right? So are we cultural beings, right? The existentialists at the beginning of the 20th century talked about the idea of obviously existence. And how did they define existence? They did not define existence. So existentialism does not look at existence. It looks at the fact that the categories that are available for existence are not enough, right? And that is what existentialism is about. It's about questioning the categories that are available for existence. For example, science or culture, right? So for example, your gender is determined by your biology, technically, right? Or society tells you that you are a woman because you're born female, right? Or you are a man because you're born male, right? And this comes from the biological category of sex, right? It is the biological category of sex that determines both sexual difference as well as gender differentiation, right? And that is what Simone de Beauvoir calls, a very important existentialist feminist at the beginning of the second wave, calls this immanence, right? The fact that you are always the other, right? You are a woman because you are not a man, and you are a man because you are not a woman to a large extent, which means that, right, all of us, doesn't matter which gender we belong to, we are always the other, right? And that becomes your immanence. Society tells you, yes, you are born male and therefore you are a man, and therefore you have to perform these roles, right? Or you have to dress in a particular way, you have to talk in a particular way, you have to behave in a certain way to be a man or a woman, and that is your immanence. Right? But then we are also given something called as transcendence, right? Sartre talks about it as free will, right? Beauvoir talks about it as more in terms of transcendence, which means that we have a certain authentic way of dealing with our immanence. Yes, we have certain immanent categories that define our existence, right? And sex and gender are two of them. Religion is one of them. Caste is one of them, right? So all of these, traits of immanence define us, yes, but they don't bind us, which means that we are all given, all of us as human beings are meaning-making beings. We don't just exist. We exist because we try to make meaning of our existence, right? And that gives us the ability to transcend that immanence, which means that if I'm a woman, I'm a particular kind of woman or a specific kind of woman, and I perform my femininity very differently from another woman, right? Say a woman from Maharashtra would dress very differently. She would speak a different language. Her idea of femininity would be very different from my idea of femininity. For example, a woman from an Islamic community, right, would probably have a very different idea of femininity from me, right? Which means that there are two very important aspects to your existence. One is immanence, and the other one is transcendence. And how do we determine the relationship between immanence and transcendence? There is something called as facticity, right? Or what certain other phenomenologists called as authenticity. There is a certain way in which you are, right? So if you go back to Martin Heidegger, he was one of the first philosophers to talk about the idea of existence as Dasein, right? The German word for existence is Dasein. And what does Dasein mean? It means being that which you are, right? It might sound a little vague and abstract, but then that's exactly what we mean. You are not somebody, but in the process of being somebody, right, you are, right? And that is your existence, which means existence is always in the present continuous tense. It's not something that you are, but the very idea that we are trying to make meaning of existence, the very idea that we are trying to transcend the immanence that is given to us, is what makes us existential beings. And this is very, very important when we look at questions of gender and culture, because we are not just cultural products, right? We are in the process of mediating with culture, right? And in our mediations with culture, our identities are constantly shifting, constantly changing. And that is what makes culture a process, because the people who constitute the culture, the people who produce or consume a culture, are also always in transition. I hope all of you are with me up to this point. Are you all following?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So when you look at the, thank you so much.
Yeah,
So when you look at the, what we call as the phenomenology of gender, which is something that comes from philosophy, right? A philosophical, you could say, position that we take with regard to gender. There are two things. One is the idea of the essential feminine, right? Which is used to define what we call as woman, right? That there are certain characteristics that a woman possesses, like, she is kind, she is altruistic or self-sacrificing, that she is soft, that she is somebody who is more cultural, more instinctive, more emotional, right? And that there are men who are more rational, logical, decisive. Okay, so there is the idea of the hegemonic, male, or the hegemonic masculine, right? And who are the hegemonic? I mean, what is the idea of hegemonic masculinity? It is based on the institutionalized idea of men as decisive, strong human beings, men as rational thinking human beings, of men as people who belong to the world. So we largely look at men as social beings, right? We look at men as heads of institutions, or we look at them as heads of families who need to carry on the lineage. What I simply mean is that men are not given as much individual identity as women are, right? Where men are largely conditioned by the communities, the societies, the groups that they belong to, the institutions that they belong to. And masculinities are always ideas that uphold a larger community or a larger ideology. These could be religious, these could be societal, these could be based on community or caste, these could be based on the very simple the simplest, most basic institution called family, right? So men continue to be institutionalized beings, and women continue to be essentialized beings, which means that, right, women are to a large extent defined in very essential terms as one kind of woman, right? Whereas men to a large extent are defined as a community of men, right? I will come to this a little later. So the question that we need to ask when we look at gender and culture is, how are men and women mediated into culture? Yes, if culture is a process of mediation, if culture is a process of negotiation, if culture is a process whereby we symbolically interact with the world, then do women and men interact differently with the world? Or do you see that they all are the same? Of course, they are not the same, right? Because a woman has a very different relationship with the world than a man does, right? And that's the whole point of looking at culture and gender, that we recognize this difference and we look at the specificities of how gender is mediated by culture, right? Yeah. So that is the next slide, mediating culture, right? So how do we define culture? I'm looking at a few definitions here. Culture refers to the conditions and the forms in which meaning and value are structured and articulated within a society. So culture has to do with meaning. Culture has to do with structure. Culture has to do with various forms of expression. How does a society express itself? It is culture, right? And look at this very interesting definition that is put together by three important feminists who look at popular culture and women. The power relations of pornography, male violence, technology, and science have increasingly come to be seen not only in terms of social institutions and practices, but also in terms of symbolic meanings, the formation of identities, and deeply rooted belief system. So you're not just looking at social institutions, but you're looking at everyday life practices when you look at gender, right? You're looking at belief systems that are deeply rooted. You're looking at ideologies which go so deep that it takes a lot for us to change those ideologies of what is masculine and what is feminine, right? And this is an ad that I normally take to my gender studies class, right? It is, of course, an ad for children's clothing. I don't know if it is very visible for you guys, but then you see the idea that, a girl's clothes is, look at the girl, right? Her clothing is defined in terms of the social butterfly, right? And look at the little boy wearing this t-shirt, which has a very interesting picture of Einstein, right? He's called the little scholar, right? And this is an ad, this is a popular brand for children's clothes. And how do we, sell these clothes? Or how do we express what it is to be a girl or what it is to be a little boy, right? So you can see that this is a recent ad. It's not a very old ad. I've chosen very contemporary texts to drive home the point that what is deep rooted is also something that, is ideologically prevalent, right? And you will see that in everyday culture. You will see that in advertisements. You will see that in film. You will see that in very popular culture texts, right? And that is the reason why we need to look at popular culture, because it is these spaces or these texts which perpetuate, right, what we call as the gender binary, right? So let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So when we say popular culture and the discursive, what do we mean by, number one, popular culture? How is popular culture different from culture? Or how do we situate the popular within the discourse of culture, right? So what is popular in popular culture, right? popular culture, right, as discursive mediation of identities, right? So very often we realize that, popular culture is closer to lived experience, right, than other forms of culture are. So for example, if you look at Bharatanatyam, okay, I don't know why I'm getting disconnected from. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Now we are
Yes,
able
ma'am.
to hear you.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm just getting repeatedly disconnected from Zoom for a few seconds, and then I have to log in again. I'll just come back, right? Okay, I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what's happening. So the whole point that we are trying to make here is that when we talk about popular culture, we are talking about everyday lived experience, right? So when you look at dance forms that are classical, you look at classical forms of art, or you look at classical ideas of culture, right? These are largely esoteric. You could even say that these are showcased in certain spaces, or they are seen as larger texts that resonate with, say, nation and nationalism or national culture, right? But you will see something like, for example, in Bangalore, we have something called as the Karaga Festival, right? And the Karaga Festival is a popular culture festival, right? Who are the people who take part in the Karaga Festival? You will see that they are people from a particular religious community or a particular caste, right? Essentially, but you will see that it is the local people, the lower classes, right, who largely take part in Karaga, right? So it is a people's festival. It is the festival. You could say that Karaga is more the festival of Bangalore, right? Just as Dasra is a festival of Mysore, right? Or it is seen as a pan-Indian festival even, right? Mysore Dasra is so popular, it is international, it is global. But we also need to understand that even as we have Dasara, which is a very esoteric national cultural text, right? We also have practices like, in Tamil Nadu, you have Kuttu, which is a dance, which is a popular form of dance, right? So there are popular culture texts, right, which are more widespread, which are more discursive, right? There are different forms of popular culture performance, right, which you may not find in the headlines, or you may not really know about them, right? But you see, that is precisely how popular culture operates. Popular culture operates in everyday life, and popular culture is closer to lived experience, right? Which means that if you want to really understand a particular community or a group of people or a section of society, you need to look at their popular culture rituals and practices, rather than, right, for example, looking at a textbook of history, right, which may not give you the lived experience of the people. And let us remember that questions of identity are also questions of two things. One is alterity. Alterity, I already told you, is the notion of the other, right? And it is your culture which differentiates you as other from other communities and gives you a very distinctive identity. And to borrow a phrase from Derrida talks about how culture or language or any symbolic meaning is constructed through iterability. And what is iterability? It is the process of reiteration of identities. And how do we do this? We do it through language more often than not, right? What that simply means is language is constituted by sameness and difference at the same time, right? So for example, when I say that this is my phone, right, I'm calling this my phone, it means that this is a phone because it is not a laptop. This is a phone because this is not my desktop. This is my phone because this is not a book. This is also a phone because it resembles other phones, right? And this is how language operates according to Derrida, right? And iterability is a very, very important foundational framework to understand questions of identity, right? Because that is how identities are formed, through reiteration. So it is primarily language or the symbolic functions we perform as symbolic beings. So these could be festivals, these could be rituals, these could be practices within a community, these could be clothes that we wear, food that we eat. All of these are part of the language of iterability, right? And culture is always defined by iterability, which means that I am, for example, a Kannadiga, right? Because I am not a Tamilian, I'm not from Andhra Pradesh, right? I'm not from Telangana, I'm not from Bihar, I'm not from Chhattisgarh, right? So there is a constant performance of identities, right? by the reiteration of popular culture, right? And therefore, Derrida's notion of iterability becomes very, very central to how popular culture operates. Popular culture is what makes a people distinct, what makes them different from other, communities or other groups of people, right? So we talked about this, right? Popular culture has to do with lived experience, and therefore it is ontological, as against systems of knowledge which are epistemological. So where do you understand popular culture from? You don't understand popular culture from books largely. You understand popular culture through practices, perhaps on the streets, right? So if you come to Bangalore, I will take you to places where you will get street food, which will give you a better understanding of Bangalore culture than probably what you would read in a tourist guide, right? Or in a book of history on Bangalore. And I'm sure if I come to Nagpur, right, the first thing I will want to buy is oranges, right? Because Nagpur is known for its oranges, among other things, I'm sure, right? So what is it that gives Nagpur its, you could say, global identity? It is probably the orange, right? And oranges are not part of any grand history or tradition. They are part of your everyday life and culture, right? Similarly, if you want to know what ragi mudde is, which was popularized by Deve Gowda when he was prime minister, and that is how Karnataka became popular for its ragi mudde, right? The ragi balls, right? So you need to come to Bangalore, and in fact, even I don't eat mudde because that's not part of my community practice, right? But if you actually come to Bangalore, you will see small stalls, right? Where they sell ragi mudde. You go to a popular restaurant, you can get ragi mudde there, right? Or if you don't want to eat ragi mudde, you can have the masal dosa, right? So why am I talking about these things? Because that is what I'm talking about is popular culture, right? So popular culture is very, very discursive in its affiliation or its affinity to the common man or the common woman, right? Or the common people, right? So, and that is the reason why popular culture escapes a lot of these hegemonies of, what you would call as, historical understanding of what is high, what is low, what is good, what is bad, right? So a lot of what we call as popular culture is largely recognized as mass culture, or sometimes even as low culture. So we make this distinction between high culture and low culture. But the point is, the culture which determines our identity, which defines our existence, is what you call, right, within quotes, low culture. It's not low culture. The idea of culture itself is popular, right? So, and that is the reason why we are looking at ontological, experiences, lived experiences, rather than epistemological systems of knowledge, right? And like Stuart Hall, a very important theorist, talked about, the whole idea of culture is the, discourse of representation, right? What is representation? According to Stuart Hall, representation is the process of representing as well as being represented. What that simply means is, even as media operates, even as popular culture operates, even as there are many texts that represent, please remember that the person who is representing, or the entity who is represented, is also part of the representation process. So I am as much part of the representation as, say, for example, the camera or the artist or the photographer, right? Or the film text, right? So you cannot separate the object that is being represented from the process of representation, right? And this is a very important aspect of the process whereby culture is produced and consumed. So we cannot look at culture only in terms of production of texts. We also need to look at who is consuming those texts, right? We don't just have to look at things as objects of culture, but understand therefore that we are also subjects of culture, right? So if you're part of popular culture, if you're watching a movie, please remember that you are also part of that culture, right? It's not like you are just sitting there and watching something that is culture, right? You are part of it. Is the consumer which makes something cultural, right? So if I'm not going to watch that movie, nobody is going to make that movie for me, right? So when we look at the politics of popular culture, especially, we need to look at the politics of consumption, right? And that is where the politics of representation becomes very important, right? And finally, I want you to look at the Foucauldian, what we call as the Foucauldian framework for looking at culture, which is, the idea of the genealogies, right? So Foucault uses two terms. One is archaeology, and the other one is he uses in plural, right? He says genealogies, right? What is archaeology? Archaeology are established systems of knowledge, right? So for example, you have the museum, you have architecture, you have the city town square, you have, for example, the Queen has just passed away, but then we have so many, if you come to Bangalore, you will see so many colonial representations of the Queen, right? And it's not as though we were colonized once upon a time and we don't have the memory of that colonization, because there is enough architecture to remind us, enough sculpture to remind us that Bangalore was perhaps one of the most colonized cities of India, right? So what that simply means is that we have systems of knowledge, right, which are given to us, which is the archaeology of knowledge, but then there is also the knowledge of experience, of lived experience that comes from people, that comes from social history. You may not read it in a history book, but then, people's histories are histories of popular culture. And that is what Foucault calls as genealogy. So genealogy is a narrative, right, of perhaps inglorious origins, he says, right? What that simply means is it does not belong to the grand narrative of history, but then to understand culture, you need to look at the social history of a people, right? If you turn towards the archaeology of knowledge, you may not get an understanding of culture. To understand culture, you need to look at the genealogies of everyday, life, right? Of the genealogies of the inglorious origins of people, right? The social life, the food, the habits, the modes, the traditions, the customs, the rituals, the oral traditions especially, right? So, we know that we have, like A.K. Ramanujan said, we have thousands of Ramayanas in India, right? So if you go to what we call as Ram Katha or a Ram Leela performance, right? The performance of Ramayana will be very distinct from, say, for example, reading Valmiki's Ramayana, right? So in fact, in Karnataka, we have something called as the Harikatha tradition, right? And the Harikatha performer will usually, contextualize whatever he is narrating, right? For example, if there is a discourse on Ramayana, he will connect Ramayana with popular politics, right? He will connect Ramayana with the city. He will connect Ramayana with a particular group of people and how, certain values are embodied within that community. So I'm sure within your own cultures, right, you have certain, what I'm trying to tell you here is that popular culture need not be traditional. Popular culture need not be old. Popular culture need not be modern and contemporary. Popular culture also is, mythology is also popular culture, right? History is also popular culture. Your oral traditions, the songs that we sing, right? So just now we had the Ganesh Chaturthi celebrations. And I think Ganesh Chaturthi is one of the oldest popular culture texts, especially in Maharashtra, if I'm not wrong, right? So, and you know what Ganesh Chaturthi means? Say for people living in Bombay, in the huge colonies and apartments, right? It is a community festival, right? It is less about religion. It is more about community, right? And you cannot separate religion from social communities in such contexts. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that when we look at popular, we don't have to understand popular as modern in the Eurocentric term or as contemporary, right? In terms of everyday existence of today, right? So there are popular culture texts which have sustained themselves and which have, cut across time and space. And I would say that Ramayana and Mahabharata are two very important popular culture texts of India, right? Yeah, because they belong to the social fabric of India. And that is the reason why you need to look at genealogies, according to Foucault, right? So these are certain frameworks that I thought would be useful for us to look at popular culture, right? So let's look at what feminism has done with popular culture, or what is the popular representation of femininities. So obviously, you see this ad, there is the objectification of women. You will see this across advertisements, right? So there is a disjunct between what we do with feminism in academics, for example, and what happens in popular culture, right? So for example, we talk about a lot of feminism, right, in terms of ideology, but we fail to look at where sexism, everyday sexism actually is created, which is in popular culture, right? So Lisbeth van Zoenen has written this very interesting book on feminist media theory, right? And she begins the book by talking about Madonna. right? So there was a time when she was teaching at a university. Of course, she's a media studies professor, and she is a, as an academician, she is a feminist media studies person, right? What that means is she looks at questions of gender and questions of especially women's representation in media. So she was invited by a local radio station to talk about Madonna, right? And they told her that she has to talk about the objectification of Madonna, or how Madonna has become a consumable Can you hear me now?
Yes, madam.
Hello?
Yes.
I'm
Yes,
so,
madam.
I really don't know what's happening. I'm just getting logged out of Zoom very frequently. I'm extremely sorry about that. Okay, sir, can you please enable screen sharing for me?
Okay, ma'am. Have you shared it? Have you
Uh,
posted?
no, sir, it says note that disabled participant screen sharing. Can you give me screen sharing rights?
Okay, you are not a co-host.
No, sir, not anymore.
Okay, okay. Because you had left.
Yeah. So it's still not enabled. Hello, sir.
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah, he's doing. You'll be co-host.
Okay, okay.
Uh,
Hello.
Yes,
Hello.
sir. Yes, sir.
Ma'am is co-host now.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, now I'm able to share. Yes, I think somebody needs to mute themselves. I can hear some voices in the background. Yeah. Okay, okay. So, yeah. So, so I was talking about Van Zunen's invitation to a popular radio station, where she had to talk about Madonna, and she was asked to take a stance, which meant that she said Madonna is being objectified, right? But as a popular culture studies professor, she refused to take this position. She says that uh, Madonna is not just objectified there, but there is a certain amount of agency that Madonna is able to create for women through her popular culture texts. And we know how we know the different avatars of Madonna and how powerful that is, right? At that point of time. So what she's trying to tell you here is that, feminism comes with its certain, ideologies. It comes with this idea that women are always, objectified, that women are not able to create their own texts. But that is precisely what Madonna was doing, right? Which simply means is, as academicians, we don't necessarily look at lived realities. We are more comfortable looking at certain theoretical positions, or we are, very, very, very comfortable using certain, terms, right, or concepts or theoretical frameworks which will allow us to read things the way we want to, right? But you look at the whole politics of popular culture, it has to do with mass culture, right? How does a popular culture, how does a text become popular culture, right? It is its popularity which makes it popular culture. It is the whole politics of consumption which makes it popular culture, right? And there are very many market forces. So even as we say Chetan Bhagat is not a good writer, as of course, for example, we say that about a lot of different writers, right? But then why is it that you will see more of such books, Nicholas Sparks or Chetan Bhagat or even Amish, on the streets? You just have to walk down the streets, you will find pirated copies, right? And what is it that people are reading? Actually, they are actually reading what are available on the streets, what is available, for them to read, right? And this is not to say that we should not look at the literary merit of a work, but what I'm saying is there are larger forces which determine which texts become more popular than other texts, right? So maybe as literature students, we do not see the merit of reading, say, Chetan Bhagat, for example. We come down very heavily upon Chetan Bhagat or Anita Nair, for example, or some of these writers who are very popular, right? But you look at the sales of these books, there is definitely a larger politics of consumption. There is a larger ideology in operation there, right? Because let's remember that not everybody can read a literature text, right? Probably a person who was not from a literature background would read, I mean, for example, I see a lot of people reading Sudha Murthy, right? Because Sudha Murthy, uses very simple English, And she has very strong cultural affinities in her text, in the sense that she talks about, everyday realities. She talks about everyday experiences, right? So, you may not read Kafka on the Shore, but you may read Sudhamurti, and that is popular culture. And we have to acknowledge that. So what is it that makes Madonna popular, right? And where do you draw the line between, say, for example, female agency, right, and objectification, right? So these are some very important questions that popular culture feminists ask, right? Because they do not assume this position of women are always objectified, but rather they would look at the whole politics of why do women objectify themselves in screen, right? And where does the market for such objectification come from, right? And does this give them, for example, sexual agency? Because for a lot of women, doing an item number might not mean being commodified or being objectified. And that is what a theorist will precisely look at, right? So I would rather be interested, if I'm a popular culture studies person, I would be interested in looking at why is it necessary for us to have an item number in every film, right? And how do women respond? Women who are part of these performances respond to this whole act of being part of the item number, right? So the questions of stereotyping, of body image, questions of embodiment, this could be at various levels. This could be transnational heterodox cultures. For example, today, what does it mean for a Muslim woman to wear a hijab, right? That is a very, very complicated question today, right? Because you cannot separate the hijab from one's religious identity, right? You cannot say this is merely a gender identity. You cannot separate gender from religion or from community or from certain other politics of gender. So how do we therefore define questions of embodiment in popular culture? Because we are not just looking at local cultures, we are looking at cosmopolitan, global, transnational, heterodox culture. So we don't have to look at just orthodoxy, we also need to look at heterodoxy. What that simply means is that we need to look at the global forces or global factors or factors of globalization that have led to, that determine the way in which we consume popular culture, and the way in which we look at women and men, right? So next slide, I will look at, see, these are certain very important processes whereby women have invested themselves in popular culture. The earliest instance is that of the public libraries, right, in 19th century, where women were given the public space to, become readers. Education was given a huge fillip in the 19th century, right, in Europe, right? And that led to women writers. And what did women writers write? They wrote the romance, they wrote Gothic novels, they wrote novels, and there was a huge surge in women's popular culture writings because there were public libraries that were introduced in the 19th century. It was possible for women to go to a library and borrow a book, bring it back home and read, right? And this is also the time when the 19th century short story becomes very popular. A lot of women take to the short story simply because of the economy of writing, right? Because you don't have as much time to write an entire novel. So whatever time you find, during your domestic duties at home, you write a short story, right? So the short story is a very popular culture text, especially coming from women in the 19th century. And you will see that this happens in India also, what we call as the lost generations, when women wrote autobiographies and memoirs rather than novels. So if you look at the nationalist phase, you will not find many novels coming from women, but you will see a lot of autobiographies and memoirs, right? And these become, popular culture texts, right? Yeah. And these are certain very important, for those of you who want to read up on feminism and popular culture, there are at least 4 or 5 names I would recommend. Naomi Wolf, Susan Faludi, Camille Paglia, and Michelle Barré, right? And Bell Hooks says, engagement with culture enables feminists to do intellectual work that connects with habits of being, forms of artistic expression and aesthetics that inform the daily life of writers and scholars, as well as a mass population. So if you are an academician, if you are a critic, if you are a researcher, you cannot be immune to popular culture, right? So if you're practicing feminism merely in terms of academic feminism, right, then you're missing out the whole picture, right? Because that is exactly where texts are produced in the popular realm, right? And this is, of course, Bell Hooks, the famous, right, Afro-American writer and critic, right? So let's go to the next question, right? The questions that we ask of aesthetics, right? So can women use the same tools that, for example, subjugate them or other them in language to dismantle the master's house? So how do women develop their own aesthetics where they are not commodified or objectified? Is it possible to do that, right? And of course, Laura Mulvey talked about the male gaze and spectatorship, right? And the fact that the visual medium is inherently voyeuristic. It is inherently scopophilic. And why do we watch visual text? Because we derive pleasure. So when you're watching a text which is meant for pleasure, right, how do we deflect the process of objectification of women? How do we change the politics of that spectatorship? So this is a very important question that we can take to popular culture texts, and we are continuing to take to popular culture texts. And this is a very interesting text by Olga Braumas, where she's looking at the whole politics of, female agency, right? So this is a poet who rewrites Greek myths. And in this poem, she rewrites the myth of Circe, right? And, Circe was this siren, this seductress who would, seduce sailors to come onto her island, and she would turn them into pigs, right? And we know that the only man who escaped this was Ulysses, right? On his voyage back from the Trojan War, he was the only man who escaped, coming under the influence of Circe, right? And look at what I would just like to read this poem, right? And I want you to look at how this poem is attempting to move away from objectification to agency, right? Yeah. The fire bites to the little death, bites till she comes to nothing, bites on her own sweet tongue, she goes on biting. And the next part is called the anticipation. They tell me a woman waits motionless till she is wooed. I wait spider-like, effortless as they weave even my web for me, tying the cord in knots with their coating hands. Such power over them, and the spell their own. Who could release them? Who would untie the cord with a cloven hoof? And finally, the last section, which she calls as the bite. What I wear in the morning pleases me, green shirt, skirt of wine. I am wrapped in myself as the smell of night wraps round my sleep when I sleep outside. By the time I get to the corner bar, corner store, corner construction site, I become divine. I turn men into swine, leave them behind me, whistling, grunting, wild. So this is a feminist take on Circe, who has always been dismissed as the seductress, right? And what is the power that Circe enjoyed over the men that she turned into beasts, right? So it's very easy for us to look at this poem as a poem that gives a woman a lot of sexual agency, right? But then, does it really give her sexual agency, or is she binding herself to the narrative that binds her already? Is she glorifying herself in a role that objectifies her, right? Is this really empowerment, or is this objectification? It's a very, very difficult question to answer. And popular culture studies has been grappling with this, especially feminist popular culture studies, right? So where do you draw the line between objectification and agency, right? What are the limits of the body, right? So what you might see as objectification may be interpreted by women as sexual agency, right? And that is where it becomes very problematic to understand how women are embodied, or how is there a feminine aesthetic at all, or is the gaze largely male, right? Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
ma'am.
Yes, again I got logged out. I think there is some serious problem with my Zoom app here, desktop app. I don't know what's happening. Anyway, let me go to the next slide. This is a very important, interesting popular culture text. If you have the time, please read it. It's called Snowflower and the Secret Fan. It's a New York Times bestseller. And this is about women who had to bind their feet in 19th century China, right? So this is a popular culture text that asks very, very, very important questions of embodiment, right? So I just have a quotation here from the novel. It says, "For us, the pain didn't lessen. How could it? But we learned the most important lesson for all women, that we must obey for our own good." Right? So normally we dismiss popular culture as something that is insignificant or not as interesting as hardcore literature or classics, as we call them. right? But it's very interesting to see how certain popular culture texts ask very important, very relevant feminist questions or questions of gender, right? So Snowflower and the Secret Fan is a very beautiful historical text about 19th century China and how women had to, bind their feet. So the smaller your feet, the more eligible you were for marriage, right? And women who could not bind their feet, right, became prostitutes. They were called as little women, right? And women at the age of, how the foot binding practice happened, their bones were broken. The bones in the feet are literally broken, right? And the foot is bound. And it's possible that you may develop an infection, that you may develop, a septic infection. There are girls who have died as a result of foot binding because there is no circulation of blood. So there is an entire century of foot binding practice, especially in the northern provinces of China. And this popular culture text is a very important, I would say, text that gives you that visibility of women in 19th century China. So the reason why I put this is here is because popular culture texts do, right, ask very important questions. This is again Olga Braumer's Little Red Riding Hood. If you have the time, please read Olga Braumer's, because she revisits a lot of popular myths and fairy tales, right? And this gives you an understanding of how powerful popular culture is and how it can challenge the notions of everyday sexism, right? I will not go into the text because I don't have a lot of time, because I want to give you as much time to look at masculinities, right? Sir, do I have another 5-10 minutes? Dr. Kapil? Hello? Okay, I will just proceed. Yeah. So we talked about the idea of hegemonic masculinities, right? So what is hegemonic masculinity? Any idea of the ideal male or the ideal man, or what it is to be masculine at any given point of time. The most ideal way of becoming a man in a particular society or culture or community or a particular historical time, that is hegemonic masculinity. And therefore, hegemonic masculinity changes from culture to culture, from community to community, from one country to the other, from one historical time to the other, right? So you will largely see that what determines the representation of men in popular culture is the idea of what is hegemonic masculinities. And we are saying masculinities because like I said, men are plural beings, they are social beings, right? We don't necessarily look at men the way we look at, say, for example, the concept of woman, right? So the operative term for any discourse of masculinities is masculinities in the plural. Okay, you will see that there are theories of masculinities. You will not find a theory of masculinity. Masculinities is the term that we use, right? So obviously masculinities requires you to be hard, tough, decisive as men, right? You are supposed to be the alpha male. And there are many practices of institutionalized violence. For example, war. War is an apparatus, a mechanism, an ideology which institutionalizes violence, which means that you have the permission to kill people. It's the same thing with rape or sexual abuse, for example, right? Men are, indirectly, they are encouraged to be aggressive, right? Because men are supposed to be tough, right? So if you look at different forms of rape, you will see that rape results from this form of institutionalized violence, because more often than not, rape is an act of power. It is not an act of, sexuality, right? Yeah. So men are constantly emasculated. And this is a term that I'm taking from Whitehead, Stephen M. Whitehead, who talks about hegemonic masculinities. And he says men have to be constantly, living up to the image of being tough and hard, right? Otherwise, they undergo symbolic castration. What this simply means is you are stripped of your masculinity if you are not tough. You're considered to be effeminate if you are not tough, right? And that is why our notion of masculinity is a notion of hard, aggressive, tough men, right? And this can sometimes translate into toxic masculinities, right? Of course, you have the metrosexual male or the metrosexual man who seems to combine a few so-called effeminate qualities, but then you will see that this is seen more as a fashion statement. This is seen more as an exception rather than the rule, because the idea of hegemonic masculinity is still a masculinity which does not allow men to be, for example, expressive or creative. You cannot cry if you're a boy to a large extent, right? Because you are supposed to be tough, right? And of course, the idea of masculinity is a very heteronormative masculinity, which means that men are seen as fathers of families, of institutions. And, for example, if you're a boy, you are told constantly that you need to grow up and support your family. You're supposed to take care. You're supposed to make sure that you provide for your family. You're supposed to be a man of the world, right? And the way in which we understand success in relation to men is very different from the way in which we understand success, in relation to women, right? So men have to succeed. Men have to perform, right? So there is a great burden on men to perform. And it is this performance, right, that translates into masculinity. Because if you do not perform, then you're not man enough, right? And you will see that, you have an image here of Rajnikant, right, and the Pala Abhishekam, right? So literally men dousing him with milk, right? Like we perform Abhishekam, for our gods and goddesses, right? And this is a very popular culture text, right, which is very relatable, right? And who are the heroes we worship, and what are the qualities we worship in those heroes, right? And why is the hero basically a male figure? That is something that you need to question, right? The heroic is often the hegemonic masculine, which is celebrated, right? And this is very common in popular culture. So I go to the last slide, right, which is the slide on cyborgs. This is very important because if you look at the cyborg refers to the machine-human interface, which transcends gender binary. And this is the cover page of Donna Haraway's The Cyborg Manifesto, right, where she says that you are half human, half animal, half machine. Of course, you can't be half if you're all of these things, but then that's a way of saying it, right? So you cannot anymore look at technology as an extension of your being, right? As much as nature is part of you, technology is part of you, right? So how is the cyborg produced? The cyborg is produced through social media, through the Internet of Things, through digital cultures, right? And therefore, it is produced symbolically like women through social interaction. So Sadie Plant, she compares the weaving of the World Wide Web to women's tradition of weaving, right? And she looks at how the Internet of Things or digital culture or social media can enable women to form communities, right? Yeah. And Haraway talks about how we don't anymore, belong to identities. We actually belong to a world of affinities. Because on the World Wide Web, right, you can be anything that you want. You can assume any position. You can assume any image, right? You can assume any identity. So we are looking at a world of affinities in digital culture, in the cyborg world, rather than identities. And as a result of this negotiation with digital culture, today's popular culture texts are in the form of cyberpunk, science fiction, graphic novels, and you will see that most of these consist of feminist utopias as well as dystopias. So women have really explored this aspect of popular culture, which is digital culture, through especially science fiction. There are a lot of science fiction writers who are feminist, right, and who look at the idea of dystopia and utopia, right? So these are certain popular culture text examples that we need to explore when we look at gender, right? So coming to the last slide, right, I have a quotation, right, here, two quotations. Whether we are talking about race or gender or class, popular culture is when the pedagogy is where the pedagogy is. It's where the learning is, right? And we need to take this to our students, right? Whatever questions of identity we are talking about, whatever questions of textuality we are talking about, we cannot ignore popular culture, because that is where the learning happens. That is where our students come from, right? We belong to the academic realm, yes, but we need to make connections with popular culture, right? So taking a quotation from Judith Butler, she says, the complexity of gender requires an interdisciplinary and post-disciplinary set of discourses in order to resist the domestication of gender studies within the academy. So if we remain academics, if we remain theoreticians, then we will not take this route that NEP is asking us to take, which is multidisciplinarity, right? In fact, whether you look at interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity, these are all questions to established disciplines, right? And popular culture could be one route that we can take where we resist these disciplinary boundaries and engage with larger questions of everyday existence, especially those of gender. Thank you. May I stop sharing the screen?
Ma'am, please throw some focus on queer theory.
Queer theory. Yeah, I did not include it because I was not very sure whether you would be able to relate to it or whether it would be permissible even, right? Because when we look at queer, we also have to look at alternate sexualities. We need to look at trans rights. Okay, so one very important shift that has happened in popular culture today is the queering of identities. So when we look at the idea of popular culture, and queer, belonging or queer resistance, you will see this in the form of body art, for example, right? So a lot of popular culture texts that are queer have to do with the questions of the body, right? So this could be a drag performance, right? You have heard of drag queens and drag kings, especially drag queens who are male to female transgender performers, right? We have some of these in our ancient performances also, right? You look at body art, tattooing, for example. You look at body piercing. You look at for example, the idea of clothing today, right, which has become extremely queer. If you want to look at queer literatures, especially in India, right, popular culture texts, actually it would be interesting for you to know that these are autobiographies largely written by trans, largely hijra women, right, male to female trans people. I would strongly recommend Revati, A. Revati, and then you have Kalki Subramaniam, who is an artist, right, and she's also the ambassador at the UN for trans people in India, for the hijra community. So you can look at Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi from West Bengal, right, who is also a performer. So you will find that popular culture texts, literary texts, are largely autobiographies of trans people today. And of course, there are a lot of films today, right? I mean, you need to look at the queer film festivals that have happened. You have to look at the the possibilities of looking at smaller audiences, even OTT platforms where you have a lot of queer text today, right? Popular culture definitely is a very important space where queer identities have been not only formulated, but also, it becomes a platform for agency, for self-expression. In fact, one of my students did an entire dissertation on TikTok videos and how the trans community in Bangalore has used TikTok videos to express themselves or to make themselves more visible or to sensitize populations towards, what we call as the third gender, right? There is the entire LGBTQ movement, and it will take me another session to talk about lesbian, trans, bisexual identities, and popular culture in these realms, right? But spaces where you could start introducing students to the queer is trans autobiographies from India. You could show them the film, I don't know if you have watched The Danish Girl, right, by Tom Stoppard. It's a very beautiful movie. It's available on, if I'm not wrong, I think it's available on Netflix. To me, that is a very powerful popular culture text, The Danish Girl, right? You could, cinema, advertising, performative art, installations, all of them have looked at, queer. Okay, I think I got logged out again. Yeah, so that's it. So, I mean, have I been able to give you some introduction to the queer in popular culture in India? Hello? Can you hear me?
You're audible.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Yeah. So begin with films, especially films that were aired in queer film festivals across the cities in India. You could look at the Pride March, for example, popular representations of the Pride March. You could look at art installations, right? There are a lot of queer spaces that have been museumized. For example, graffiti or installations, or there are modern art museums in cities where the queer is very popularly represented today, right? So these are, in fact, to understand queer has still not entered into academics as much through popular culture. I think we need to seek the queer popular culture out on the streets, literally, right? Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am.
So are you able to hear me? Hello?
So I now invite Dr. Rupesh Deshmukh to propose the vote of thanks.
So are there any questions from any of the participants?
Ma'am, may I go ahead with the question?
Let me check with Dr. Singhel whether we have time for questions, because
Yeah, we have, ma'am. We have time.
I have another 5 minutes actually. I have to join another meeting at 12.
Yeah, I know.
Yes, please go ahead.
Ma'am, can you differentiate between lived ontology and epistemology in the context of popular culture, and how to understand it in
Okay.
these two various perspectives?
Okay. So what I was trying to tell you is that popular culture largely belongs to the ontological, right? Because what we call as popular culture is born out of everyday existence, and it is something that is produced every day, right? So, for example, you may not, for example, look at a book of history, right? As popular culture, because it has to do with a very systematic knowledge of documenting facts from the past. It is based on rational, verifiable data from the past, right? Whereas when you say visit someone's house, or you visit a community or a festival, you're part of a festival, you get to know a lot about the history of that community through performance, through music, through art and tradition, right? So this is the realm of popular culture, right? Popular culture comes from lived experience largely, right? Whereas you look at something like Bharatanatyam, it is a long traditional art form, I mean, with a long history, right? It comes with a certain yeah, it comes with a certain politics of not only tradition but also hegemony, right? So there is a politics of caste, there is a politics of practice within certain communities. There is a politics of nation and nationalism there, because Bharatanatyam is, for example, seen as an Indian dance form, right? Whereas something that is more local has to do with the everyday life of people. So epistemologies are knowledge systems, and they are largely constructed through rational ways of approaching a discipline or a subject. Whereas popular culture does not need these disciplinary boundaries. It exists among the people, for the people, and popular culture is created by the people, right? So that is what I was trying to tell you. I hope I have made myself a little more clear.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Have you been able to relate to what I was saying? Have I been able to give you a few insights?
Yes, ma'am. It was very, very interesting in the way you talked about. You gave us a new insight into popular culture, especially the theoretical angle that you talked about. In many of the lectures that we hear on popular culture, we don't get the insights into Foucault, the hegemony versus popular culture binary.
Exactly.
And then Foucault's idea of culture and genealogy, that aspect, how to look at popular culture that way. And very interesting was that how objectification actually turns into
sexual
a medium of agency. That was very, very interesting. I really enjoyed, and it was a great intellectual experience.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah. Any more questions from the others? I think I have another 2-3 minutes to spare. I'm extremely sorry. I think I I got logged out a few times, and there is so much to talk about popular culture. 1.5 hours is not enough, but thank you. I hope I'm like you said, hopefully I have given you a few places to begin with, right? Yeah.